Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine. I'm the Adult Services Librarian here at the library. I just want to thank you for coming this evening. I also want to thank the Village of McFarland Cable Department. They're taping this tonight, so it's going to be on the YouTube channel. So if you had friends and family that weren't able to come tonight, they can watch it later. I want to briefly introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Joshua Mezrich. Dr. Mezrich graduated from Cornell University Medical College and spent time at the University of Chicago and Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston doing his residencies and fellowships. Dr. Mezrich has been part of the UW Transplant team since 2007 and specializes in kidney and liver transplants. Dr. Mezrich was named one of Madison Magazine's top doctors in 2016, and When Death Becomes Life, Notes from a Transplant Surgeon is his first book. And we do have Mystery to Me bookstore here tonight, so we'll be selling books after the program. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mezrich to the McFarland Library.
Thank you so much. It's awesome to be here. I was just thinking, I just finished reading that book, The Library Book by Susan Orlean, which is a really fascinating book. And it made me remember how special libraries are. And I remember when I was a little kid and I got my first library card and it seemed so special and exciting. And it just kind of reminded me the role that libraries play, this important role they play in the world. So I'm happy to come to the libraries and talk and share some of my stories. It's really special to be here. So I thought I'd say a few words about kind of what inspired me to write the book, why I wrote it, a little bit about the journey that has been so great for me. I've enjoyed it so much. I kind of grew up always loving books and in a family of books. We read a lot in our family. When I was younger, my parents instituted a rule that we had to read 2 books a week. I had 2 brothers, so 3 of us, and my parents would read the books too, and then we would talk about them at the dinner table. And I suppose you could end up hating books in that scenario, but I always really loved them. My brother Ben, I'm the youngest, I'm the baby, and Ben's the middle brother and John's the oldest. Ben is a writer, and he's written, I think his 21st book is coming out in May. He's had some big bestsellers. And I've always enjoyed watching his career, and I've always thought I had at least a book in me, if not more. I didn't really kind of solidify what I would work on until around 2011. I was reading the book Emperor of All Maladies, which was the Mukherjee book, really about the history of cancer. He's an oncologist who had finished his training in Boston, and he wrote this beautiful book about cancer, but he used his patients to tell this story. So he would go from talking about a current patient and then go back to the history of that cancer or whatever drug he was going to treat them with. And it was really beautiful. It won the Pulitzer Prize. It was a really much longer book, like probably more in-depth scientifically. But I was really moved by it. And I thought, I want to do something like this with Transplant. But I thought I wanted to do it a little bit differently. For one thing, I really wanted to tell a little bit of my own story. It's been quite a tough journey trying to become a surgeon and then, working as a surgeon. And I've always liked reading about other people and how they do what they do and what it's really like to do what they do, whatever the field might be. And I wanted to write that for people outside of the field of medicine so they could really understand what it's like to do what we do. I also wanted to tell the story of our patients, of course, and our donors as well. I think transplant is this incredibly special field where we have the recipients, but we also have the donors, and where other fields, maybe you spend all your time trying to prevent death or fight off death, or maybe give someone a good death, which is certainly important. In transplant, in a way, we start with death or we take from death, and I think that's this very beautiful concept. I really think the donors are our patients as well and their families, and so I wanted to convey that. I also wanted to write about the pioneers of our field. There's something very unique about transplant. It's really remarkable. It's really a story of innovation and something probably we should all be proud of. But if you think about it, in the 1940s into 50s, transplant was totally science fiction. There were a few people here and there who would try to do it, and most people thought they were crazy. They eventually learned how to sew organs in, between animals, but they couldn't make them last. They didn't know anything about the science behind it. And then from the 50s into the 60s, there were a few limited successes and a lot of failures. And then 70s, started to work a little bit. And by 1980, or I like to think of 1983 as when transplant actually became a reality with the approval of cyclosporin as an anti-rejection medicine. So you think about it, it really was from 1950 to 83, it went from science fiction to reality. And that's just remarkable. A lot of the pioneers were still alive when I was starting to write the book. And I wanted to go around and talk to them and not just find out what they did, because I knew what they did and that's written in other places, but like how they were able to do that, because they had patients dying in front of them on the table, under their hands. They had colleagues saying they were crazy, people signing petitions saying, get these guys out of here, they're murderers. And they persisted, and they didn't just persist, but they knew it was gonna work out. It was in their DNA that they were like, we're gonna make this work. And it's easy for people to say, oh, those patients would have died anyways. That may be true, but that doesn't ring as a useful statement to me, because as someone who's had patients die on my OR table, it's, even if you can say they would have died anyways, it's such an emotional burden and toll for everyone involved that to be able to persist through that is just something different than the average person. So I really wanted to understand what drove these people, how did they deal with it, what were their coping mechanisms, and I wanted to compare my own coping mechanisms with theirs so that it would give the reader some sense of what this is about. So all of these thoughts were in my head, and I started to kind of think about how am I going to do this. And one thing I'll tell you, if any of you guys want to write a book, I do recommend you get a brother who's a best-selling author. That's definitely like step one, I would say. Or a sister would be fine too. Maybe even a parent. So that was incredible. The biggest kind of practical thing Ben helped me with was getting an agent, which in itself can be a huge challenge, but Ben helped me do that. It turns out when you write nonfiction for like a popular audience, not like maybe a textbook, but for a trade audience, you actually write a proposal and sell that. You don't write the whole book. I would call it a treatment because I'm in the field. You guys call it a proposal. No, I'm just kidding. And you write that and sell it. It's totally different than the fiction world where you actually typically will write the whole book. And it's apparently a lot harder for editors to figure out what fiction is going to sell. So even someone like my brother would have trouble selling fiction, whereas nonfiction, he'll at this point write like 10 pages and he sells it, which is kind of crazy to think about. But so anyways, I talked to my agent. I told him this story and what I wanted to do. He said, okay, that sounds good. Why don't you work on a proposal? And that should be a kind of short thing, maybe 50 pages long, that kind of describes what each chapter is going to be like, a little bit of a sample of your writing, but the reader can read it and say, okay, I think they can write this whole book. I get that it's a whole story. So I said, okay, great. So I went home and I was working like crazy, and I sent him the book, the proposal, and the title of the proposal was The Legend of Big Daddy. Because I make my fellows call me Big Daddy, but that's another story that I don't want to get into. And my agent just called me and said, no, we're not doing this. So then I spent a year going back and forth with my agent working on the proposal. And it was an incredible learning experience. He played a huge role in this part of it. He basically would assign me like, okay, let's work on this part now. In this chapter, I really want you to convey a little bit of your writing style. I want you to write a few pages that are actually an excerpt. And then in another chapter, be like, this one, let's not do an excerpt. Just write like a real, almost an outline version and describe all the characters that are going to be in there. And so he helped me a ton with that. And so after a year, we decided we were ready to go shop it. We had this proposal. So he sent it around to publishers. And the way it works is that it kind of reminds me of the alcohol and beer industry. You drink like a craft beer and you think you're drinking this craft beer, but it's actually all owned by InBev, Budweiser. You don't even realize it. Maybe not every single one in Wisconsin, but many. That's kind of what like publishing is like too. I think like Penguin Random House own almost everything. But they have lots of different imprints, and each imprint will have editors and their own publishers and their own budget. And so those editors will buy the books and then work with the author to make it into a book. And of course, they're judged on how well their book does. We ended up having 6 editors and imprints that were interested in the book, and I went and interviewed with them all. It's funny because they all worked for the same company, I think, but a couple of them were at HarperCollins, which is where I ended up at Harper, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. And they were all, it was really an incredible day. I flew into New York, and it's such a cool world, the world of writing, and each one has its own feeling to it. The first one I went into, like everyone was dressed in leather and this cool music was playing. I was like the oldest guy there. And I felt really cool walking around there. They're all beautiful. And I at first was like, oh, this is where I'm going. But then I realized like, I don't think this is going to work for me, but they're actually really good. They have a lot of good books. But anyways, when I met my editor, Gail Winston, the thing I really loved about her, so the other places they would have you meet with a publicist and an editor and a publisher, and they're trying to assess, can they sell you and sell your book, and trying to kind of wow you with all the different things they can do. Gail was just alone with the publisher, and she's a very senior kind of editor, many Pulitzer Prizes in her writers, and she said, listen, I read your proposal, I really love it. I think it's going to be really hard to do, but I think it can be great. And she's like, I don't want to waste your time with a publicist. Like, we can do all those things, but that's not really what's important now. You know, I want to help you write the best book you can write. And I was really moved by that. I respected her immediately. I was a little afraid of her. It kind of reminded me of my relationship with my wife. Super high quality, a little bit nervous. And I ended up going with Gail. And so then she's like, okay, let's do it. And I'm like, what do I do? She's like, well, do you want to write the book? And I'm like, well, okay, should I write like a chapter or two, or should I write the whole thing? And she's like, well, you can do what you want. A lot of my authors will just write the book and then give it to me. But if you want to, I said, let me just write a few chapters because I've never written anything. So I wrote a few chapters, and the first chapter was just, it's hysterical. Like, it's just pure comedy. And then the second two were a little more serious. And I sent them to her, and she gets it back to me, and she's like, okay, so I need you to trust me here. We're cutting the whole first chapter. I'm like, it's hilarious. She's like, it's very funny, but I don't, she taught me so much about establishing a relationship with the reader, about respecting the reader, about giving them credit that they're going to understand things, they're going to remember things, treat them with respect. It just was incredible, the way she serves her public, her readers, and the way she thinks about that. It was an amazing ride. But anyway, so then she was like, all right, why don't you just write the book? And I was just obsessed. I couldn't wait to write. It was so enjoyable. And I'd never done this. I mean, I've written some articles and I've written a lot of grants and papers, but I'd never done anything like this before. And I couldn't wait to write. I was still working as a surgeon, which is a vaguely difficult job, but I couldn't wait to write. So I would get up every morning at 4 and run downstairs and write till 6. And then the kids would get up. My wife is a super hard worker too, so she would sit down in the study with me and we'd write together. But then every weekend I would write all day, every vacation. I just was obsessed with it, which I enjoyed it so much. So then I get to the end of that year, so this is a year of the proposal, year of the book, and I'm like, I'm done. And then I'm looking at it, I'm like, it's pretty long. And so I said to my brother, Ben, I said, how long is a book? Because I couldn't, it's in a word processor, you can make it any length you want. And he's like, well, we do it by words in writing. He said the average book is 60 to 120,000 words. And how long is yours? And I said, I'm not going to tell you. He's like, no, tell me. And I said, it's 300,000 words. But I should say, Ben, on top of getting me the agent, he gave me 2 pieces of advice that worked so well for me, and I think they probably work for most people. Number 1, he said, when you start writing your book, just write. He's like, don't worry if it's good. Don't worry if you digress. It doesn't matter. He said the number 1 reason people don't finish their book is they just try to make it perfect. They can't get going. They keep correcting, and they just never even get a first draft. He's like, that's the normal scenario. So he was like, just write, just go. And that worked really well. The second thing he said, which actually was great for me, was he said, the hardest thing is when you get up and you start writing, like to get going, like you start surfing the internet, the TV's on, the kids, whatever else is going on. He said, so that what he does is, he said, never end at the end of a session, at the end of a chapter. He said, end in the middle of a story, or even in the middle of a sentence. Because he said, then you get down there and you pick it up and you start going, and all of a sudden you're going and you don't even realize it. And those 2 pieces of advice worked really great for me. He writes, he has a goal, like a certain amount each day. But I mean, this is his full-time job, and I didn't do that. I just, if I had time, I kept writing, and if I didn't have time, I stopped. But those other 2 things were great for me. Maybe too good, because I wrote so much. But I had digressed a lot during the writing. For instance, when I was writing the chapter on Alexis Carrel, who's one of the kind of old-time surgeons who discovered the vascular anastomosis, a very interesting character. He did win a Nobel Prize for the vascular anastomosis, but he also was a really big eugenicist. I mean, pretty much everyone was before World War II. He got a little Nazi-ish towards the end of his life, and actually when he died, he was in Vichy, France, and there was some question about whether the Nazis were supporting him. I don't think he was a full-on Nazi, but he was Nazi light, I guess. But you have to remember, like, every major academic figure, leader, Supreme Court justice in our country was into eugenics before World War II. There were courses at UW on it. It was considered a legitimate science. So like that would be a topic, for instance, I digressed like 50 pages on because I was so fascinated by it. And I knew I'd be able to cut those things. So anyways, Gail and I then spent about a year cutting the book from 300,000 words down to 100,000 words. And I thought that would be painful, but actually it wasn't. I enjoyed all of that. I feel like the book was so much better. I feel like I have another 2 books that happen to be The Cutting Room Floor, and a lot of them are really funny. But I feel like what we came up with is something I'm so proud of, and it really was a team effort, and I couldn't be happier about it. I want to spend, I don't know how much, I might have a couple more minutes and then I'll take questions, but I want to spend a few minutes like diving into the book a little bit. It's funny when I did my launch in Boston with Ben, and because he was so great. Yeah, you know, like most siblings, right, have some sibling rivalry, and I mean, he's had none of that. He's been so supportive through all of this, and I just feel like that's been very special. Like most of us, like, I don't know, I'm in the grant world in science, and when someone else gets a grant, you're happy for them, but you can't deny that deep down you're like, I'm kind of jealous. I feel like I'm better than them or whatever, I don't know. But I don't think he has that. I think he really just wants the best, and he's just that kind of guy. But I have told him now he has to do transplant. Any type of transplant, even hair would be okay, now that I'm a world-famous writer. But anyways, when we did the launch, actually it's really funny. He's read a little bit of my book, but not all of it. Probably not much of it, which is the one bad thing, I guess. But when I went to Boston, we did some radio shows, and he was there, so he heard the interviews. And then we got to the Harvard bookstore, and there were 2 chairs up there, and he's like, oh, do you want me to introduce him? And they're like, no, we thought we'd have you interview him about the book. And I was like, you didn't read the book, did you? And so we got up there, and he literally did the exact same interview that the Boston radio guy did. So like halfway through, I started answering his questions before he asked them. I'm like, you're probably going to ask next about... It was so funny. But anyways, I've been reading a few different sections from the book, and he made fun of me because he said the writers don't do that anymore. But, I mean, humor me here, humor me. It's just so well written, I can't. So I start and end the book on an airplane. A lot of people don't realize that aren't in the world of transplant that we have to go out and get the organs. The operation is actually pretty complex to get the organs out. It has to be done correctly. It has to be done in a way that you can use the organs. And so it's a major part of transplant. We usually fly on planes owned by the state. Our standard plane is this Pilatus turboprop, but sometimes we take other propeller planes. So it's not the Learjet that everyone assumes we travel on. So this is how the book starts. Chapter 1, A Perfect Organ in a Small Plane Over the Hills of La Crosse, Wisconsin, September 2 a.m. While I'd been on planes many times, I'd never experienced the full power of a thunderstorm at 10,000 feet. The small King Air, a 6-passenger dual prop, was bouncing around uncontrollably. Every few seconds it would go into free fall and then hurl itself back up violently. The 2 pilots in the cockpit were hitting knobs and dials, trying to silence the various alarms that sounded as we rocked violently back and forth. It didn't help that our physician's assistant, Mike, who had been on hundreds of flights in small planes before, was screaming uncontrollably, "We're gonna die! We're gonna die!" There was a certain word edited out of that sentence. Actually, it's funny because I think the book is pretty benign in terms of language, but there are a few words. And so my mother-in-law is the one person who said, "I was really surprised by the language. You don't, you don't curse." I'm like, "Well, did it occur to you I don't curse in front of you?" I mean, just skipping a little bit. It was the 3rd month of my transplant fellowship at the University of Wisconsin. I hadn't chosen transplant surgery so I could fly through thunderstorms in the middle of the night over the fields of central Wisconsin. Hell, I'd grown up in New Jersey, spent most of my life in the Northeast, and had never known anything about the Midwest. I'd been drawn to Madison because it is one of the best places to be a transplant fellow. That remains true to this day. I think we should all be really proud of what people built here in Madison. It's truly a top-notch transplant program that I would argue is one of the best and definitely the best training program around. So we're really proud of that. I jump around with time a lot, and this is what I spent a lot of time working with Gail trying to get right. The kind of backbone of the first part of the book is the history, and then I jump around in my own life as I move in and out of it to make it fit the history. So I write about Alexis Carrel, which is really the early history of transplant. He's the guy who figured out how to sew 2 vessels together. It's hard to imagine surgery existed without that. But then it really goes to right around World War II with Dr. Kolff, who's the guy who discovered dialysis, a truly remarkable figure living in the Netherlands, who basically would sneak around and save people by day who were going to be sent to concentration camps. He himself wasn't Jewish, but he saved many, many people in the Netherlands. And then he would sneak around at night and build these dialysis machines and dialyze people by the dark of night. Just remarkable. And then I start getting into some of the surgeons who were involved in making transplant a reality. But all the time, I jump back and forth with my own stories. And then once I get through the history, I move on to the patient stories. I like this other passage because it captures what I think about illness and what I think is special about transplant. I just go through talking about a young woman who I went through a lot with, and she went through a lot but did great in the end, got a liver transplant, had a number of complications which we got through, and then ultimately had to get a kidney transplant, Cindy, and then her daughter gave her the kidney, and she went from being so ridiculously sick to just being perfect through a long period of time. Her family was with her all the way, would sit with her. Of course, they couldn't suffer with her. I mean, they suffered in their way. But then when it became time to get a kidney, her husband and her daughter immediately jumped forward to do that. Her daughter ended up giving her the kidney. And I thought about that, and I've always thought about this, where, of course we sit with our loved ones and we struggle with our loved ones and we do anything to make them better, but ultimately they are the ones who bear the burden of the illness. And transplant is a little different. So this is what I write. This is why I love the field of transplant. Since I began taking care of sick people, I have noticed that one of the hardest things about getting sick, really sick, is that you are separated from the people you love. Even when families are dedicated to the patient, illness separates the well from the sick. The sick suffer alone, they undergo procedures and surgeries alone, and in the end they die alone. Transplant is different. Transplant is all about having someone else join you in your illness. It may be in the form of an organ from a recently deceased donor, a selfless gift given by someone who has never met you, or a kidney or liver from a relative, friend, or acquaintance. In every case, someone is saying, in effect, let me join you in your recovery, your suffering, your fear of the unknown, your desire to become healthy, to get your life back. Let me bear some of your risk with you. I really think about that. I mean, our donors, like living donors for kidney, they do great, and the data is really good. But I think in the end, those numbers don't mean that much. No matter what, it's always this leap of faith. It's this unknown. You're always taking on some risk. You're going to have some pain and recovery. And to me, it's like running into a burning building to save someone. It's this beautiful thing. And maybe some of that risk, however small, is part of the beauty of donation. In the book, I taught one of the premier transplant surgeons in our country, Nancy Asher, who's was chairman at San Francisco for years. She just stepped down, but still operating. She donated a kidney to her sister. And despite the fact that she's done this operation 10 times more than I have, she still said, you know, it really was this leap of faith. It's this, you know, she's always in control. I mean, she's one of the most powerful surgeons I've ever met. But, you know, you give up all control. You kind of give your body to someone and say, please take care of me. And of course, if you operate on your chairman, you're going to have a complication. So she got a little port site hernia the day after surgery, no big deal. But of course, they blamed her for it. Had to take her back to the operating room, but she did fine. But I always think about that. Like even she would call it a leap of faith, and was maybe felt differently about it than she thought she was going to, knowing the data. I just have like a few more minutes probably before. Yeah. Just let me. Then I'll read one more piece and then I'll take questions. I could read the whole book to you guys, but then no one will buy it. So, but I just want to read the end of it because I don't want to give it away, but I make it through. I just want to tell you. I don't. I like that line. I don't know. But I ended on a plane as well. That was a bit of a better flight. So as the plane levels out at 20,000 feet, I look over at Felix, our German-trained procurement surgeon, stretched out comfortably in his seat, headphones on, fast asleep. Wide awake myself, I look out at the night sky now lit up by the moon. For a second, I wonder what I'm doing here, flying in this little plane over the farmlands of Oshkosh, separated from my family. My two little girls, now sleeping peacefully at home, will wake up in the morning and discover me gone, an experience they're quite familiar with. I shift my gaze back to Felix, along his extended legs, and down to the cooler he is so unceremoniously using as a footrest. Inside sit a liver, 2 kidneys, and a pancreas. Somewhere else in this same night sky, under this same moon, 2 other planes are flying in different directions from ours. Each one has a cooler. One contains a heart, the other 2 lungs. Just 2 days ago, these organs were working in concert, allowing a 42-year-old father to eat, drink, go to work, hold his kids. These organs helped him climb up on his roof to clean out the gutters, but they couldn't stop him from falling off. Now they sit in ice until they will be filled with blood and return to the living, ready to sustain a new body, allowing 5 other people to live, love, be happy, be sad, enjoy their families. These 5 people don't know one another, don't even live in the same city, but they will forever be joined by the web of transplantation. They will be saved by some guy who will never get to see his gift of life. But maybe, down the road, his wife and children will, and maybe they'll think, yes, he was some guy. I know that's what I think. I lean back and close my eyes, but I can't sleep. That's how it ends. Thank you. I guess I can take questions. I can always keep talking because I can always talk.
And I do have a microphone for questions, so we can pick it up on the...
Do you ever get to follow or meet the people the recipients or their families?
Yeah, so I do both surgeries. So I do, personally, I do liver and kidney transplants. I take kidneys out of living donors, and I do some procurements on deceased donors, although a lot less than I used to do now that I'm getting old. So I do follow them. And one of the things that I think is awesome about transplant, we pretty much follow them, our patients, forever, right? Because as you know, see some friendly faces here, but once someone gets a transplant, they're always kind of one of our patients. And what I love about our team is that, like, when I go to round, I don't even know where my patients are. I just go on the floor and walk down the hall, because you just look at the names and you know a lot of the patients. We work very much as a team, so we all see each other's patients. We all take care of them. We work with medicine and surgery. It's very much multidisciplinary, which I really like. The truth of the matter is, once someone gets a transplant, a lot of docs and other care providers out there are afraid to take care of them because of the medications that they're on, make everything more complicated. And on top of that, a lot of the patients say, I'm going to Madison because I don't want you messing with my organs. So we kind of have a policy that we're like, anytime someone wants to transfer, no problem, bring them in. Or the patients know they can just call their coordinator and we'll just admit them right onto our floor. And it's really different than other areas of medicine. I mean, I think in the old days, right, docs would follow their patients forever, outside the hospital, inside the hospital, the Marcus Welby kind of thing. And that doesn't, maybe in a small town, but for the most part, that's not really how healthcare has moved. But I do feel like in transplant, it's still a little bit of that. And I love that. I mean, we have such a wonderful setup. We have these amazing coordinators and mid-levels who make our lives so, I mean, they do the bulk of the work, but, and I think I give them a lot of credit in here, but, and then, all the nurses and everyone that's involved in the village that we are, but we all will take care of anyone, anytime. It feels like that. And so I feel very close to them. Yeah. Yes. Oh, you're getting a mic.
I got a big mouth. My question is, today, as a matter of fact, when I said I was coming to listen to you, a friend of mine said, well, now they can take part of a liver and it will grow to the recipient's liver and grow from there, right? And I said, I do believe. But what about a kidney? Do they have to have the whole kidney, or do they take part of the kidney? And my thought was, well, honestly, I'm no doctor. Of course, you're the expert. But I thought it would have to be the whole kidney. Is that correct?
Yeah, you got it.
You can't just take part of a kidney.
Right. I mean, you can remove part of someone's kidney if, say, they have like a tumor. So if you have a patient who has a tumor, you need to cut it out, but their kidney function is not perfect, you might do a partial nephrectomy. But for transplant, you take the whole kidney.
Yeah.
And you're right, for liver, you take, if it's an adult to adult, about half of the liver. Yeah. So we do this is an interesting thing, I'll go into it. So with kidney transplant, a living donor is a lot better than a deceased donor. The kidney works longer, it works right away, and of course you don't have to wait on a list for it. We do the donor surgery laparoscopically, so through the smaller incisions, and I even do some through the belly button. But it's still a major operation, and we have to really make sure people know what they're getting into. But they do great. They're short stay in the hospital. They recover. The risks are low, but not zero. The risk of kidney failure in a donor is something like 1% over their lifetime. That is higher than if they don't donate. That's definitely true. But it's still a pretty low number. And these are well-evaluated donors that are healthy, obviously. We make sure everything is perfect. Liver's a little bit of a different story. It's certainly a bigger operation on the donor. The outcomes of living donor liver are pretty similar to deceased donor liver. So that's a big difference from kidney, where a living donor kidney is so much better than a deceased donor. It's a little bit more complex operation because you get half the liver, so you have to split it, so you get smaller blood vessels, because instead of getting like the main hepatic artery, you get like the right, And not all people have the anatomy such that you can divide their liver. But the challenge with liver transplant is livers are given out based on how sick the patient is, and it's getting harder and harder to get livers. So patients have to get really sick before they can get a liver, and that's tough. Not only is their life miserable and their recovery miserable, but they can die before they get the liver. So the advantage of a living donor liver is you can do it when they're a little bit healthier, making everything a little bit easier. But it's a big operation on the donor. The risks of dying are low for a donor, not zero. They're never zero with surgery, of course. But, people throw around data, something like 1 in 200 to 1 in 800 is the risk of dying in a liver transplant. Now, I always get nervous giving people data because, I think if I say to you in the audience, oh, your risk of dying in a surgery, not a donation, but in a surgery is 1%. Most patients are like, oh, that's great, I'll never die. Whereas a surgeon is like, that's a really big number. I mean, and patients always say, oh, I could go outside and get in a car accident and die. And I say, no, this is the car accident. You've gotten in the car accident. Actually, this makes me want to read a little. Can I read something? Can I? This is this great book. You got to get this book. So anyways, we do both. We do living donor liver. We do even more living donor liver to kids. That's where it kind of ends up being a good scenario because you can take a smaller piece of the donor liver and it can be harder to find.
Age group? Okay, I'll tell you why I was asking this.
Yeah.
There was a little baby this week on the news.
Mm.
I can't remember the state of it.
Oh, is that right?
Okay, where their oldest son, I think, he's gonna need a liver, and the baby is gonna need a new liver. And then I was like, oh, I can do that, maybe I'll work. And then they were like, at the end, whatever sequence, like, well, they have to be healthy, can't be pregnant, can't plan on getting pregnant, and they have to be less than 40. I said, oh, I'm out,
For liver?
Is that,
That's not our situation.
how does that work?
Well, so for a baby from an adult, you can usually just take what we call the left lateral segment of the liver. So it's a really pretty small piece of liver in a smaller risk operation. All operations are major. I always tell people that a liver resection is major. But a left lateral segment is a very manageable surgery. So I certainly think that's much lower risk than taking someone's right lobe. For donors, our cutoff for liver is 65, although that's somewhat flexible. You just got to be really healthy. We do a very thorough workup. You can't have other major medical problems. You have to be the right blood type, compatible blood type for liver transplant. We don't have a swapping program yet, which we do have for kidney. Those are kind of the major things. We sometimes have to do a liver biopsy beforehand to make sure. We start with scans and MRIs, but sometimes we have to do a liver biopsy. But that's our cutoff. For kidney, we actually, I don't know if we have a cutoff. We've done many donors at the age of 78 who wanted to donate a kidney to a spouse, and the two of them felt like they were going to get a ton of benefit, and we've been able to do that. But age is just one thing. You got to be healthy. That's the key thing.
What's the oldest person you've done?
Donor, recipient, or donor? So recipients, for kidney, we've done people in their mid-80s, but they need to be the kind of mid-80 where you're like, you look not a day over 50. Liver is a funny thing. As people age, they usually start to show their age, if you will, when it comes to liver transplant. We don't have an absolute cutoff, but when people get into their 70s, we do a very thorough workup, I guess I would say. The main thing is if your heart's in good shape, you haven't had years of diabetes, you have a decent chance. So that's a little bit about that. I'll hold off on this, yeah.
So I heard that there were some studies using not healthy organs, like people with drug addiction and with the opioid crisis. This was kind of like a positive byproduct of the opioid epidemic. Is Wisconsin doing studies on that or open to
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah, so a few things to unpack there. So it is true that the opioid crisis a lot of people didn't realize this, but like almost a silver lining to it has been that it's really increased organ donation, and something like a 20% bump in organ donation across the country using these organs, because a lot of these patients end up, they stop breathing, they get a hypoxic injury to their brain, and they become brain dead. And a lot of them are young and otherwise healthy, which is obviously tragic. But I do think it's a population that the family often donates for a lot of different emotional reasons that you might, giving some value or something like that. The organs are usually good. I mean, they take a hit when a patient dies, but that's the reality of any deceased donor. Now, there is a higher risk, depending on how they took the drugs, of infectious issues. If a donor died, say, from needle use, then we do have criteria to consider them what we call high risk. Now, all of our donors are tested using DNA testing for all the viruses you might worry about, HIV, Hep C, Hep B. And the tests are really, really good, but it's always possible you could miss the window period where their body hasn't converted, but they have some virus. The odds of that are extremely low, like less than 1 in 1,000 type, assuming we've tested them in there. Nevertheless, we do tell patients, recipients, if they fall into this high-risk category, whether they're willing to consent to that or not. I mean, the truth is, when you look at the data, it's obvious you would take that organ from a good donor versus waiting if you're very sick. We have entered this different era now, so like hepatitis, I think there are a couple different victories that healthcare should be cheering about. I mean, we don't know how to pay for healthcare, that's one thing, but we have had some massive advances. So like Hep C is so treatable now that we'll even give Hep C positive organs to negative recipients with consent, obviously, and then treat them afterwards. And that's happening more and more. You're seeing articles probably in the newspapers about that. And these drugs are remarkable. We wouldn't do that with HIV to a negative recipient. There are, although there are only a couple of cases where HIV has been cured, but for the most part it's managed with antivirals. But that's not something we'd want to transmit at the time of transplant. There have been some HIV. There just was the first positive living donor kidney to positive HIV recipient, but that's kind of a newer thing. But it has happened that diseases like that have been transmitted at the time of transplant. It's just very rare. Actually, there was a case some years back where rabies got transmitted to all the recipients, and then in retrospect, they were able to identify that the donor had been bitten by a bat like a week before. Actually, it was really bad. All the recipients died. And so since then, that's one of the questions that gets asked to the family, but I'm not sure people would always know. Because that's not how the person had died. They just happened to have been bitten by a bat, but sort of a random one. But for the most part, it's pretty darn safe, but we're not perfect. There's other types of marginal organs. So I don't consider those marginal organs. I consider they might be higher infectious risk, but they can often be really good organs. But then there's the challenge of we don't have enough organs to go around. People are really sick. Do you take organs that aren't quite as good? A liver that has a little fat in it. A liver that its liver numbers are elevated, a kidney that's a little bit older, the biopsy shows a little bit of scarring. These are things we do with good consent and discussion. I wish we had a perfect organ for everyone. We're pretty good at it, but it's hard to make it perfect when you don't start with a great organ. So there's always this battle in transplant between kind of not having enough, people struggling on the wait list, how long can they wait, what's the better way to go. It's a lot of thinking about that. Yeah.
What's the time frame from the time, you put that organ on ice to the time it's into the patient? Is there a limitation to being on ice do you go, okay, we're here, let's go to surgery? Is it that kind of a thing?
Yeah, it depends. Each organ is different. So a little bit of it is how quickly do you need the organ to start working. So for like a heart, where you really want the organ to kick in right away, they'll typically start, open up the recipient and put them on bypass while you're still procuring the heart. and then they fly back or drive back, and then they sew it right in. And I think you want a heart ideally under 6 hours on ice if you can. For, you know, an organ like a liver, it is nice if it works right away, because otherwise they're going to be really oozy and we end up packing them for a while. But it's not quite the acuity of the heart in that sense. But we still start our liver recipients usually while the procurement's going on. We can do livers under about 12 to even 15 hours. Now, some of it depends on the quality of the organ. If you're pushing the limits on an organ, you want to get it in faster. For kidneys, where kidneys are tough buggers, they can wait a while. And also we have dialysis if needed, if it doesn't kick in right away. We can wait longer, so it's not uncommon that we'll do a kidney at 24 hours. I've even done kidneys at 48 hours on ice, and they've been okay. We are moving into an era of pumping organs that's actually quite interesting, where the idea of pumping organs has been around for a long time, and actually Dr. Belzer, who started our transplant program, was really into this concept, and so we've been pumping organs forever. But we used to pump them cold. Nowadays people are doing normothermic perfusion, so like room temperature type, and pumping with blood, and there's some newer systems that do continuous perfusion pumps into these organs, and we're finding that they're reperfusing just beautifully. And there's this concept out there, although it's early in the research, that maybe you can even repair marginal organs, like take a fatty liver, put it on the pump for 24 hours and actually defat it, if you will. Yeah, there are people that are in Toronto, which is a group that's doing a lot of this with lungs. They're even trying gene therapy, where they'll try and put in certain genes to reduce the immune response when the organ goes in. Some people are talking about, can you treat Hep C in a donor in the organ on the pump before you transmitted it, transfer it. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on. We're in a trial with livers using a pumping system called the Organox, and it's been great so far, but we're still in trial stage, so we can't say whether it's better or not. But like with marginal organs, it seems to be better. Yeah.
So do you like do side-by-side surgeries where the living donors in one OR
Yeah.
and the recipients in the other, and you just go whoop?
That's it. That's what we do. So we're in, yeah, so we do, like, we try to do about 2 living donor kidneys on Thursdays, one's on Wednesday. We do about 110 a year, so it's not quite every week. And yeah, we have a donor room and a recipient room, and the recipient room, they have a camera so they can see what we're doing, although they don't really need that, but they like it. We actually, though, kidneys have gotten really interesting. So for the longest time, people had been thinking about swapping kidneys around, right? So say you want to donate to your sister, but you're incompatible blood type. Then you say, well, what if I donate to someone else and then their donor donates to my sister if they're incompatible? That's what we call paired exchange. People have been trying to get that to work for years and years. The challenge was initially people would try and like make the donor fly to the hospital where the recipient was and and that was a non-starter. Like nobody wanted to fly somewhere to get a surgery that they didn't really need. Like that didn't make a lot of sense. We've gotten really advanced, and there's this program called the National Kidney Registry, which is based in New York, which was started by this guy who wanted to donate a kidney to his daughter, but he was incompatible. He was a businessman who did a lot of computers, and he ended up quitting his job and starting this program, and it is really awesome. So we are all the time now, every week, pulling out a kidney and sticking it on an airplane. It goes in a cooler, it goes on a commercial jet, it flies to New York, to California, to wherever, and they plug it into their recipient, so maybe it's 8 hours later, 10 hours later, and then we have a kidney show up and we plug it into someone else. Even beyond, and so it's all done by computers, by this algorithm that matches up. And so that's awesome. Even cooler is if we get someone that, what we call a non-directed donor, or we used to call them humanitarian donors, who just wants to donate out of the goodness of their heart, that kidney can start a chain where we can have that kidney go to someone that has a donor that can't donate to them, so they get that transplant, and then that same day their donor donates, that goes to someone, and then their donor donates to someone, and it can swap back and forth across the country. And I think the biggest chain was something like 56 pairs, went over like 3 months, crisscrossed the country like 3 times. It's really remarkable. And the chains keep going until they break, something happens, and then they give the last kidney onto the wait list. So there's been some real advances that have been really fun. Yeah, I've done that, yeah.
My question, my father was involved in medical research back in the 50s and 60s, and they were doing a lot of research in prisons. And that the ethical issues finally really got to him, and he had to discontinue. Are there places that you're running into barriers or walls or places that you don't feel that you can go beyond?
That's a really interesting question. So, the whole concept of prisoners and transplant has been sort of an interesting one. Actually, the first lung transplant back when it was a really questionable treatment, I think this was 1963, was done on a prisoner who, they really had no chance of it working. They could get through the operation, but the guy wasn't going to live. And the surgeon who did it told the prisoner he wouldn't get anything out of it. But then the governor heard about it and said, if you go through this, we're going to release you. And so that became quite an issue. And he was released for the 12 days that he survived and then died. So a couple of things. We do transplant prisoners. This is an interesting topic because we do provide health care to prisoners, right? And I guess transplant falls under that. And I think it's good that we transplant prisoners in general, but I think it's also challenging because, of course, transplant depends on the public trust. And I've often thought about that, like what would people feel about that if, I don't know, their loved one died and their organs went to a prisoner? There are probably many prisoners who deserve to be transplanted, but what's the right way to think about that? I don't know the right answer. Should it matter to the donor or not? Would it? Does it depend what they did? Is that something we should even know? I don't know. These are really complicated things that we sometimes get in arguments about. There have been a lot of different ethical issues we think about a lot in transplant, not exactly related to prison, but like, for instance, just an obvious one, and I cover this in the book, liver transplant for alcohol. In the very early days of transplant, people didn't want to transplant alcohol. Then Tom Starzl, who I cover in the book, who's the father of liver transplant, made a statement that a liver transplant is an incredibly sobering event, and he said we should be doing it. It turns out that it's not always. I think the recidivism or return to drinking rate is, when you study it, is usually in the kind of 20 to 30% range. I think if someone, the truth of the matter is this: disease in general, in my opinion, is always some part genetic, some part behavioral, some part bad luck, right? At least for adults. And there's so many things in healthcare where people played some role in their disease, and I think that's okay. But I do think it's important that a patient with alcohol-induced liver disease has insight. I think if we transplant someone that doesn't have insight, we're not really fixing their problem. We're just kind of resetting the clock. So that's really important. But it's really hard. Like, if someone shows up and is young and is going to die, and you have this treatment that could fix them, and you decide not to do that, that's a difficult thing to do. Now, for a long time, there was this rule that was followed around the country, actually mostly because of insurance companies, that said patients had to be abstinent from alcohol for 6 months before they could be considered for liver transplant. That's not a law. That's just a norm that a lot of centers had followed, and a lot of insurance companies would say we're not going to pay for it unless they have 6 months sobriety. The truth is that 6-month sobriety was based on a tiny little study of like 40 patients that suggested those patients that were sober for 6 months had less return to alcohol. But that hasn't really repeated out. I mean, the truth of the matter is that's no better of an indicator than so many other things. The one thing that's good about it is objective, so it doesn't allow you to say, well, I like this guy, or I like his family, so I'll transplant him, and I don't like this guy. I don't think the 6 month is perfect because there are all these people who might have 2 months that really could do well with a transplant and are clearly insightful and have a great support, and you have every reason to believe they're going to do well. But when we do it other ways, we make mistakes too. So this is something we continue to struggle with, and so I have 2 chapters in my book about this. One wonderful professor who some of you may know, Herb Henneman, who tells his story all the time, who was a very successful professor of business and was an alcoholic and hit rock bottom, struggled, got insight, got transplanted, and he's done awesome for like 30 years and is a wonderful human being. Was more than happy to share his story. But then there's this second woman who is this beautiful young woman who had 3 kids and a husband, successful family, and the kind of person you interact with and connect with immediately and think, oh, she's going to do great. And transplant went great, and right back to drinking. And none of us even saw it because she's so believable and so relatable, and it just showed you how you make these judgments based on someone that you connect with. And it's a tragic disease. I mean, she's not a bad person. She had this terrible disease that pulled her from her family, but the liver transplant didn't fix that. So that's something we struggle with every day. Yeah.
So how do you decide, or who decides who gets the transplant or whether you will?
Yeah. So we have we have listing meetings for each organ, and so like for the liver listing meeting, each patient is presented, and they'll have a coordinator. That's typically a nurse that will present the patient, their data. We have the surgeons, the hepatologists or liver doctors. We have the social workers, the AODA or alcohol and drug specialists. So they'll each say, they interview each patient and will say their piece. Now sometimes the patients are too sick to talk, if they're confused and encephalopathic, so that's going to be just what they can get from family members. And then some of our nursing team will be there, our trainees, medical students. And then ultimately we discuss it and try to come to a consensus. It can sometimes get very charged and difficult, and there can be times when people have disagreement. And the challenge is you're making a decision about whether they live or die. And so that's very difficult. I mean, we want to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, but we also feel that, I feel at least, that we're really stewards of these organs, and that's part of our responsibility. So we just try to do our best. I've often wondered about this. I don't have all the answers. I have most of the answers. No, I don't know. But I've often wondered, is it better if I'm the surgeon of record and running the meeting, for instance? And it's not like I just decide, but someone has to, in the end, summarize it and make the decision, which you try to do with everyone. Is it better if you've met the patient or not? Because sometimes I think maybe you shouldn't know the patient, because it doesn't matter whether you like them or what they look like or what, right? It's just do you think they can do well with a transplant? Do they have insight? Do they have the family support? Do they have the medical things they need to get through it? When you meet people, often you either really like them, and you're or at least you feel bad and you want to save them, or maybe you don't like them or some inherent bias. So I wonder about that. Maybe the person running the meeting shouldn't have met the patient. I sometimes think that. It becomes harder to make the decision often when you've met the patient. But it does mean a lot when family, alcohol is such a disease that separates the family, that so many of these patients will have these broken families, these terrible relationships, because that's what that disease does. And so making sure they have family support is a critical piece of that decision. It's difficult, and I often wonder, should we think about what the donor family would think, or shouldn't we? We have difference of opinion about that. I care a ton about the donors and feel they are part of this, but of course a donor can't say, I want my liver to go to this, X person, this religion, this color, that you'd never allow that. But they clearly have some important involvement in it. I don't know, this is what makes our field fascinating.
There have been records of people that have been, had multiple liver transplants that were And is there some kind of protocol with that follow-up? Because I know that's happened.
Yeah, I mean, so we do random kind of alcohol testing on the list, and if someone tests positive while they're waiting, we will remove them. If someone loses an organ from alcohol, I mean, alcohol is not the only issue. There's also like non-compliance. So even on the kidney side, someone stops taking their medicines, they reject their organ. Should they be retransplanted? The most common time that happens is, of course, people get transplanted as kids, they become adolescents, they go to college, they stop taking their meds. And you're not going to say that person, you can never get a transplant again. I wouldn't say that offhand, but you would say, at least for kidney, you can say, fine, you're going on dialysis for a while. You're going to have to realize what this means and kind of, figure out how this happened. The problem is for liver, you don't always have the luxury of time to be able to say, you got to wait and figure this out. We try not to retransplant someone if they, trash their organ from terrible decisions. I mean, we try to hear what happened, but certainly if someone went back to drinking, no one's going to support that. But we can be wrong. We can miss it. I mean, we don't investigate them, it's actually funny. When I wrote the book, I've gotten a bunch of really wonderful notes, and one was from this professor somewhere out in the West, who they use social media to kind of figure out what decisions people are going to make she's not in medicine, but for financial stuff. And she was like, do you want me to help design a program where you could, use their social media to figure out if they're high risk of drinking? We've traditionally not searched patients on social media. I've always kind of thought that felt like crossing some sort of barrier we shouldn't be doing, but I don't know. I mean, everything's on there nowadays, but that isn't something we traditionally do. We do our best. We're pretty good, but still I think we're off 20% of the time. Yeah.
You had mentioned that UW has one of the best transplant programs and one of the best training programs in the country, and I wonder what determines that. What makes you say that? What's good about it?
So it's a couple of things. So one is the volume. So we just do a lot of transplants. So for instance, we do 300 to 350 kidneys a year, which is a top 5, and every now and then we've been number 1. We're the biggest pancreas program by far in the country. So for type 1 diabetes, we do over 60 pancreas or pancreata a year. Livers, we do 110 to 120 livers. We do a smaller heart and lung program, more in the 20 to 30 range. But when you think about the size of our city, and we're as big a program as you'll find in New York or San Francisco, it's really quite remarkable. The other piece, our OPO, or our Organ Procurement Organization, which is the organization that interacts with the donor side, is, I don't know if any of you have interacted with them, but they are the most wonderful group of people. From top to bottom. Actually, the guy Mike who was screaming on the plane, he's their director now, but amazing guy. But they're just this incredible group of people that are so committed to their mission, and I can't picture a better group than them. So that's one part of it. Wisconsin has high rate of donation. I think part of it is the kind of state it is, a lot of smaller towns, people are a lot of pride. Some people from other states who say, no, you guys aren't that good, say, well, you actually have more people that die in ways that would lead to organ donation, motorcycle. This is one thing I didn't realize, because I'm from New Jersey, but I didn't realize people go up north bar hopping on snowmobiles, which sounds incredibly fun, but it's also a way to become an organ donor, unfortunately. But anyway, so I think that we do have a high rate of potential donors, but there's just a lot of awareness about donation in this state. But I think the other thing is the infrastructure we have at the hospital, at every level, from the nursing floor to the ICU to the OR, people are just so committed to transplant here, and we attract the greatest fellows from across the country. So we're about to interview our next batch, where we have 20 people interviewing for 2 spots. They're all cream of the crop at the best programs. We're really committed to training. So when we do operations, we work with our fellows, and we're like, you're going to learn how to do this operation. And we spend the time. Obviously, we care how our patients do, but we're very committed to training this next group. And we take the time to, the people who started, like Belzer and Dr. Kalaylu, who some of you may know, our Turkish surgeon who started our liver program, he always used to say, it's not a fellowship, it's a friendship. Like, it really is like this. People are so proud to have trained here. And so from every top to bottom, everyone is just so committed to this program. It really is like the flagship of the hospital. When you go outside of Wisconsin and people think of the hospital, they immediately think of transplant. The solution that the organs are preserved in across the country is called UW solution, which was invented here. It was one of Worf's big money makers for many years. It's off patent now, but it really is just an incredible program.
I shouldn't do this, but I can put a plug as a retired med tech from University Labs and worked really hard, and OPL was always good, and
Yeah.
phone calls when people are in town, I know people grasped it, but we were part of the team, and I was proud to be as a.
Yeah. It's a great hospital. I feel really proud to be a part of it. And, you know, I hope it, as healthcare changes, it continues to be a great place.
Hi. You've talked a lot about the craft of being a transplant surgeon, but I have a question about the emotional side.
Mm.
And you started your talk by saying you interviewed somebody about the coping mechanisms they used, and I wondered, how do you process your emotions? Do you have a ritual, or how do you
Yeah.
get through these gut-wrenching ordeals sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, it can be really difficult, and I probably think deep down I probably don't have exactly the right constitution for the job, but you know, this is something a lot of the reason I actually wrote this book was thinking about this in myself and wondering what these others do. For me, like my number one obvious coping mechanism has always been humor. I always look for the funny side of things when I go into an operation that's going badly. I always, maybe inappropriately so, try to get the room lighter, try to get people working together, laughing, feeling positive. That's just my strategy. But it's hard, I mean, when things go wrong, and particularly like, this is a field where, I mean, most patients do well, but you spend all your time thinking about the ones that don't. And sometimes it's your fault. Like sometimes you made an error, sometimes it's not. And I've just always been a very, very honest. I think if you read the book, you'll get that. It's very honest. I'm very transparent. I've always taught the fellows and said, just own your mistakes. Tell the patients what happened. For me, it's been great. I'll tell them what happened. I say, I'm sorry this happened. I'm going to be there with you. We're going to get through it. You know, you just got to stick with them. And I've found that the times that's happened, I've ended up even closer relationship with the patient because I'll be there for them. It's painful in some ways because when something goes wrong and someone gets a complication, you see them every day and you're like reminded of what they're going through every day. And it's worse for them than for you, I guess. But it is painful. But it's also beautiful. I mean, people are always amaze me with their strength and their ability to push through things. And but it's difficult. I write a lot about this in the book, and each pioneer had their own coping mechanism. Some of them used alcohol. Some of them, like Joe Murray, who won the Nobel Prize, was the first kidney transplanter. He was sort of this analytical religious guy, so he really would look at the data and be like, okay, we can use this for the next one. Starzl, who's like the world, you know, the transplant surgeon, he had like no coping mechanism. He just was this brute guy, but he could never forget anything, and he suffered greatly and retired early. And after he stopped operating, said like, I always hated it. I never could handle it. I don't know if that really is true or not at the time, but that's how he describes it. Then Roy Calm, the kind of British surgeon who's one of the fathers of transplant, discovered cyclosporin, well, figured out cyclosporin could work in transplant and did so many things. He just loved every second of it. He's like, oh, Joshua, it was wonderful. He's still alive. He's 88 now, and he was totally unaffected by it. He enjoyed every second of it. It just, he cared about his patients, but he was kind of like, I'm involved in this really awesome thing, and that didn't bother him. Each one had their own mechanism. I do write about this. You can tell I can talk forever, but I do write about this one thing that I really like, a piece of advice that was given to me, that every surgeon needs to have a box, a metaphorical box. And in that box, you can take your complications and put them in. You need to be able to access that box so that when you're with the patient and with the family, you can say, this is what happened. I'm going to be here with you, but you know, this is what happened, and we got to just push through it. But you also need to be able to close the box so you can go home with your family and your kids and not be fretting about it every second. And I know surgeons who can't access the box and they're totally cavalier, and that's not what you want. But I also know surgeons that can't close the box and they're just head is spinning, and usually they crash out of the field. But I love the field and I have no regrets, but it is hard to live in the moment. It's hard to go home when a patient's not doing well and be with your kids and not be checking the labs and thinking about it. And it's a very difficult thing. My wife's a surgeon, and that actually has been a good. Originally, I wanted to marry like an architect or an artist or something to go home and learn something different and do cool things. But it actually is really great because we really understand the challenges of that, and we communicate in that way. But and I write about this, like, originally I was thinking, I hope my kids don't go into surgery, because although it's this wonderful field, it does prevent you from living what you might think is a normal life. But I don't know, as I've come along in it, my older daughter would be a good surgical personality, actually, and we sit and watch Grey's Anatomy together, which is a little bit embarrassing, and there's a lot of sex in that show, which is even worse. But she actually sits and asks me about the medical and surgical pieces, and it's really fun. So I do love the field, but it's a challenge. It's a challenge. Yeah. Yeah, these are the best ones. About Grey's Anatomy? I am McDreamy, if you want to know.
I was in the medical field for 40 years, and I know back in the day before we had the pneumatic tubes that went throughout the hospital and everything, we used to have to be runners, to take the boy back and forth from the OR,
Right.
for heart surgery. And it always cracked me up because they would always have music, very, calm, soothing music going through things. And then at the end, when it was all said and done and a success, one of the surgeons would say, "Okay, hit it," and we'd have this. It would just be like this joyous song that would come on, and I always cracked up because it's like, seriously, but it was just their way of kind of letting things release. The intensity of the surgery. It cracked
Yeah.
me up. So, do you have? Do they play music?
Oh yeah, this is in the book actually, but I'll give it away. So you guys are gonna be surprised, but for whatever reason, I'm really into hip hop in the OR. So it's all usually Tupac on Pandora or rap music. I don't know. Like if I'm operating all night on a liver and you're getting started at 10 at night, you know you're gonna be there for 10 hours. And it's going to be physically demanding. I always have needed like some upbeat music. We put on some funny. We do a lot of Pandora and pop music, hip hop, rap, this kind of stuff. I've done a few podcasts and interviews that are fun, but I did bring a crew into the OR. I think it's great. There could be a few moments that are mildly inappropriate, but. So this show, To the Best of Our Knowledge, which is a WPR show, which is a wonderful show, I brought them in the OR for a donor nephrectomy, and then they interviewed the patient as well, and they interviewed me in the studio, and you can hear the music going if you want to listen to it. You can download it. But yeah, we always have music. I think actually so much of surgery is about controlling your emotions, staying relaxed, taking a deep breath when something's not going right, figuring out, can I figure this out? Do I need to call for help? How do you solve the puzzle? It's all about solving the puzzle. And sometimes the puzzle has 100 pieces, sometimes it has 1,000 pieces, but you got to stay calm. And when things don't go right, it's really about this internal strength, like take a deep breath, all right, step back, what do we need to do? How do we figure this out? And knowing when to call for help, I mean, that's critical. We work very much as a team in our group, and we don't hesitate to call each other because you got to get it right. I mean, for the patient, it's not about, you got to be humble. It's not about how good you are. But music helps with that. Some people listen to like classical music, and I love classical music, but at 10 at night when I have to operate all night, it's not going to do the job. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Joshua. That
All
was
right.
wonderful.
Thank you.
for coming to our library tonight. Jane is in the back if you want to get a book signed or buy a book. So thank you for all coming out tonight. Really
Thanks,
appreciate
guys.
it. Yeah.
Hey, guys.